panel on the Marvel Age. I think there may be a more precise title, and I wrote it, but I've forgotten it. So my name is Mike Cobrey. I'm a professor here in town at Queen's University of Charlotte, teaching in the Department of English, teaching classes on comics and pop culture and modern literature. For some strange reason, they asked me to moderate this panel. So I'm going to do a brief introduction and then let the experts, the real experts, speak. I'm counting on you guys. So the focus of this panel is to consider the legacy of Marvel Comics in the 1960s, from 1961, obviously with the publication of Fantastic Four #1, to somewhere around 1967 or 1968. Obviously this year is a good time to have this conversation, or an important time to have this conversation, because since the convention last year, we've seen the death of Steve Ditko on July 6th, 2018, and then Stan Lee on November 12th, 2018. And of course, if we're talking about the legacy of Marvel Comics in the 1960s, it's impossible to have that conversation without including Jack Kirby as well, understating all of these things. So Lee, Kirby, and Ditko are the trinity who created and defined Marvel Comics, and I want to think about their legacy today in that particular period of their careers, though perhaps not exclusively. Just to get the discussion going, I want to set a few things up with a couple of assertions. This is me as an academic talking, thinking about Marvel and its influence on culture from the 1960s. And I would say in those years, Marvel changed the way superhero stories were told, the narrative conventions of superhero stories. They didn't introduce these narrative conventions, but they developed them, they elaborated on them, they complicated them, they deepened them, and all subsequent superhero stories in comics form and film and television in many ways have been influenced by this. And of course these characteristics are a shared universe and an ongoing narrative continuity. And as I think about this as a scholar trying to write about this, if there's a moment that I would pick, and I'll offer this very tentatively where this all started, it's Amazing Spider-Man #1, and Spider-Man breaks into the headquarters of the Fantastic Four, the Baxter Building, and asks for a job. It's as if breaking into that headquarters, he began to efface the boundaries between different series and different characters. Second reason I think this is important to consider is that Lee, Kirby, Ditko, and ultimately others too, I believe essentially created a new narrative form in those years in the 1960s. And now we have seen that narrative form migrate to other media, particularly film. You know, think not only of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but the Star Wars universe, the Disney universe. There's now more of a MonsterVerse with Godzilla and King Kong, and no doubt others as well. So this form of storytelling they created in this time, which is only one of their achievements, has had a huge influence on our culture. In fact, there was a headline a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times. Popular culture now is kind of storming high culture. There was an article in the Sunday Arts and Leisure section where a panel of critics was responding to the colossal success of Avengers Endgame, and I think the headline of that article is really telling. It's Marvel's universe, we just live in it. And I think that's true. We've seen the conquest of the culture at large in 2019. So that brings us, of course, right into the controversy. And I suspect we'll spend a fair amount of time addressing this today. Who did what in those years? Who should get the credit? How do we assess the accomplishments of each of these three creators? And how do we assess the accomplishments of these creators in collaboration? So to explore these questions, we have a great panel. Starting at the far end of the table for me, Steve Sappel, the Senior Acquisitions Editor of Titan Books, who helped co-author Joe Simon's autobiography and is the editor, among many other books, of The Best of Simon and Kirby. Mark Evanier, who worked as Jack Kirby's assistant and has written a fantastic biography, Kirby, King of Comics, with just fabulous artwork in it as well. Mark also has an extensive career as a comics and television writer with multiple Eisner Awards and Emmy nominations. And close to me at the end of the table, where I can keep a watch on him as best I can, is Craig Young, an author, editor, cartoonist, designer, and comics historian, who has his own fantastic imprint, Yo Books, and I see a few samples of those right here. No doubt we will talk about those a little bit. So what I want to do is to begin to ask each of our panelists about 5 minutes or so to talk about the importance and the accomplishments of each of the individual creators. We'll begin with Steve talking about Stan Lee, Mark about Jack Kirby, and Craig about Steve Ditko. I'll pose a question or two after that to follow things up, and then we'll just turn them loose on the floor and see where we go, and hope that there are no terrible confrontations that evolve from it. All we have to hold those confrontations is an English professor, so you're doomed. So I'll leave shut up, and Steve, maybe you can start us off talking a little bit about Stan Lee.
Okay. I worked with Stan a bit when I was at Marvel. Worked on a lot of his essays in the Marvel magazines like Marvel Age and the Collector's Previews, and I got to work with him a bit also in the promotion and publicity side. And one thing that Stan was extraordinarily collaborative, and there was never a problem working with him or even asking something of him to get it to be done so that it was part of a larger, if we did a theme issue, he would follow the theme and discuss his era of that theme, be it monsters, be it X-Men, be it whatever. Over the years, I've had a sense of Stan as, if you apply the term genius to him, and I do in sort of a way of someone who is exceptionally talented at something, I think he was very intuitive, because I believe that Stan often made some of his best decisions when he had about 30 seconds per decision to make, to do it. And I would talk to guys like Romita and Russo's, and they would remind me of times when they would go into his office, and here's a cover, and he would say, stat that up, make that green, and add a dialogue balloon there. Boom, done, you're out. And it was almost always a good decision. It didn't necessarily mean he was perfect all the time, but he was just moving on what was, I think, a sort of an intuitive energy. I think he did have one advantage over most everybody else in that I do think he had a long view, which is why we had Spider-Man by Steve Ditko, we had Spider-Man by John Romita, we had Spider-Man by Gil Kane, and we had some really extraordinary things go on in each of those eras. I hold as one of the best scenes in comics the death of Captain George Stacy. I think that's even more poignantly handled and more perfectly handled than the death of Gwen Stacy, because it was just so subtly done. And that was with, Stan Lee and Gil Kane. And yet, what can be more powerful than the Steve Ditko page in Spider-Man 33 where he's lifting the rubble off? And it's just one of those pages that with Steve and with the power of Steve Ditko behind it, it changed the way a lot of people saw how comic books were done. So again, there's this collaboration and this ability to collaborate, but the fact that you can have so pivotal a moment in Spider-Man 1, Spider-Man 33, and Spider-Man, I think, like 89, I think. So, I mean, it's this long view, which unfortunately a lot of creators don't have. A lot of creators will have a flash of brilliance that'll last 5 issues, 10 issues, 20 issues, and then you'll have 100 issues of the late Kirby Fantastic Four. And you'll have, Spider-Man going continuously since 1962. So I just think that that's one of his major contributions, was this combination of this intuitive knowledge of what made the story work for you guys, and setting it up to be able to go for as long as you want it. So that to me is sort of his thing. I have one other thing. I have another minute here. I have one other thing. I have a book that I've been thinking about recently that is sort of, to me, proves some of Stan's editorial side. It's, oddly enough, Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos number 18. And it's the issue in which, in the beginning, on the first page, Sergeant Fury and his girlfriend Pam are caught in a blitz, and there are bombings in London. And they get through it, and he spends the issue, he's decided to marry her. And he's carrying the ring, he almost loses the ring, it's a big adventure, he fights a Nazi captain and all this. And then at the end, he goes to her house to propose. The The father opens the door and says, "Oh my God, I didn't know you were coming. Nobody must have told you. After you left, there was another bombing. She was caught. Tell my sergeant I loved him." And the last panels are his hands, just a close on his hand opening and the ring dropping out and then him walking away. And it's just really one of the best scenes in comics. I think Dick Ayers turned in a great issue, but I think Stan said, wait a minute, there's something more needed here. Pages 1 and the last page, I guess page 20, were drawn by Jack Kirby. And I think he said, this is what is needed here. It's got to be more, and we got it, and it's what makes it one of the most perfect issues in a way that I've ever seen. But to me, that's probably a good editorial call on his part as the writer. And so, you know, to me, that's a good example of Stan's process.
My turn, okay. I guess my credentials here are, I believe I am the only human being alive who worked for both Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. And I knew Steve Ditko for a while. I mean, we had a little fight and talk after a long time. All of us who knew Steve Ditko had a little fight. Steve is nodding in agreement. I agree with just about everything my friend Mr. Saffel said here. Stan was a very good editor. You know, frequently in the business, the editor is just the guy who's got the job. You know, a lot of people in comics, especially in the early days, got jobs by nepotism. You know, where you get a job just because you're related to the guy in charge. Thank God that doesn't happen anymore in our country. I think. Stan was very fortunate that he had Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, two guys who were probably unemployable elsewhere at the time, or well, I suppose Ditko could work for Charlton for even worse money than Marvel was paying. But he had these guys, and he was fans of them. You know, he was a guy who really appreciated what they had to offer. I'll go quickly. I'll just tell you this. I went to Bob Kane's funeral, and we're standing on, I swear this is true, only a couple people from the comic book field were there. And Stan was one of them. And so we're standing next to, Stan and I are standing next to the gravesite. They're getting ready to lower Bob Kane's remains into the ground. And out of nowhere, Stan turned to me and said, you know, Steve Ditko was the best inker Jack ever had. I was kind of going like, shouldn't we be looking at Bob?
Bob was taking care of that for himself.
The thing was that Stan had this enormous appreciation of those two men. And he started talking about how great Ditko was, how great Kirby was. And he was completely right about that. He appreciated them. And he let them be them. When Jack was working for DC, they kept complaining, you draw too much like, you don't draw like a DC comic supposed to look, which I thought was Kirby's greatest asset. At Marvel, that's what his asset was. He didn't draw like Kurt Swan.
It's actually why they hired Simon and Kirby in 1942.
Yeah. Anyway, so, anyway, Jack Kirby was the most brilliant man I ever met in my life. And I've met some very brilliant men in television and other fields and animation. And Jack was this guy who had ideas and thoughts just poured out. Jack couldn't not give you ideas. If you went to Jack with your idea for a brand new character, he would tell you more about your character than you knew. Look at any interview with anybody who ever did this, they would tell you this. I took Jack a couple of ideas one time, and he suddenly starts telling me things like, wait a minute, it made me think, did I tell him this idea before and he spent weeks thinking about it? No, right on the spot, he would tell me a new idea, a twist from my idea, or what if he had the character do this, or what if he had this power, whatever. And a lot of, I think, what the Marvel Age was built on was Stan Lee listening to Jack and Jack standing going, I don't like that one. Oh, that one, we'll do that one there. Which is a talent, you know. Collaboration is an odd thing. Sometimes a collaborator does makes his most valuable contributions by saying, let's go back to that other idea you had. Or why don't we just cut that out in the middle? A lot of the Beatles songs, when Lennon and McCartney were working together are really cases where one of them wrote the song and the other one said, the middle sucks, let's take that part out, or whatever. And how do you quantify that? There's no way to measure the value of saying, let's leave out this, or let's trim this down, or let's do this in another order. So it's very hard to separate what they did. I have a very simple way to answer when people say, what did Stan do with Jack did? They both contributed to the stories. I think in a lot of those, Jack contributed a lot more than Stan. Stan got the sole credit for the stories. I think that was very unfair. I think just about everybody in the industry thinks that was very unfair. The brilliance of Jack Kirby is through all the Marvel comics. So is the brilliance of Stan Lee. Jack's had influence on comics that he didn't even draw, or he did the cover, and the cover gave the plot to the story when Don Heck had to take plot something out, or Carl Brooklyn or somebody else. Steve Ditko was a very brilliant conceiver of ideas, and another guy who you couldn't just turn into a robotic slave who would draw what he was told. One of the many reasons Ditko left Marvel was that Stan kept not following what they'd agreed on. Steve Ditko had a whole chart in his office listing, what's going to happen next month in Spider-Man and the month after. It was all plotted with very meticulously. He had like 3 years plotted ahead. And Stan would suddenly come to him and say, hey, let's stick Dr. Doom in the next issue. And Ditko got crazed by that because he was very methodical and he felt he was in control of the storylines. Just as Jack felt he was in control of the storylines on Fantastic Four and Thor and Captain America, whatever he was doing, especially after the first year or two. So when you say, who contributed what, my answer is they all contributed an awful lot. And it's hard to sort this out. You can't say, in a given Beatles song, exactly what Paul contributed or what John contributed. I was writing a lot of variety shows. I worked in comedy rooms where, 6 writers are pitching ideas, and an hour later you couldn't quite remember who came up with what. And sometimes one guy came up with something, another guy put a twist on it, another guy put another twist on it. And you'd end up watching the finished show and going, I think that was my line. That's how collaboration often works. And it's silly to think that, this long after the fact, we can separate it. But we shouldn't recognize that Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko made enormous contributions, inventing characters, inventing villains, plotting stories, doing all this stuff. And Stan knew what to do with it. He knew how to plus it, how to add things in the dialogue, how to change things and such. I know people who don't like Stan's dialogue. I happen to like it. I know people who don't like the way Jack Kirby draws. I happen to like it. I think sometimes we get way too bogged down in trying to slice and dice this down into an unknowable fact of who contributed what. I just think that storylines in a lot of Lee Kirby comics sound like Jack Kirby storylines.
I think I was told to kind of talk mostly about Steve Ditko, and these guys certainly covered so much great stuff, and they're so insightful and brilliant, and probably bigger Marvel fans than I am. Marvel comics got me into comics because my junior high friends, a couple of them started collecting and secretly told me they were reading comic books, which was verboten back then. I mean, you were entering adolescence, and many of us boys were looking at girls, and we didn't want to embarrass ourselves and have a social death by revealing to anybody that we were reading comics. But they turned me on to Spider-Man, and I got one, and I enjoyed it immensely, and it reminded me of when I was a wee lad reading Carl Barks, Uncle Scrooge, and John Stanley, Little Lulu. But this was cooler, and in junior high you were supposed to be cool. So I thought this was way cool, and I think that I just got gobsmacked by this wonderfulness, and so it's interesting, this period we're talking about, 61 to 67 or something, that was when I read and collected and died for secretly Marvel Comics, but it was the name Steve Ditko on that, you know, getting that credit on those comics that got me wanting to be an artist. And I knew I never could be as good as Steve Ditko, but so I became an art director, which is kind of an anti-artist, you know. But I think, you know, people talk about Stan, I'm segueing here from that. People talk about Stan as an editor and a writer and a promoter, and I think he was all that, you know, to a genius degree. But I think I like to apply the word art director to him, because he was able to really see art talent in I haven't read all of any of the Stan bios, but I don't think they talk about him. I've interviewed him a couple times, and I tried to talk to him about it a little bit, and he said he started his love of comics started by him copying, you know, drawing pictures from the Sunday Funnies. He really liked Seeger's Popeye, and so he was an artist. I think did he draw some artwork for some military newspapers or something like that?
Posters.
Or posters, that's what I was...
About venereal disease.
Right.
Assuming we're against it.
Yeah. I've been drafted to do a couple venereal disease posters because they said, Craig, you've got it. So Stan was a great art director, and you know, I want to be heartfelt and controversial, because that's good for a panel, right? I give Stan all the credit for creating all the characters, writing all the stories, and all the dialogue, and I think Marvel Comics was Stan Lee, because he infused us so much with his personality. And so Mark is seething here, and Steve wants to kill me, but Stan gets all the credit. If you want to write that down, we can end the panel right here even. But Jack Kirby was the king of comics. Are we all agreed on that? Yeah. That too, also, in addition to Stan being the creator of all the characters and all the stories, we also agree as artists, Jack was king of the comics. We were all agreed on that? Yeah. Okay. Well, Jack was the king, but Steve Ditko, Jack King Kirby, Steve Demigod Ditko. Steve just he created these worlds, and they, in a way, these drawings of Spider-Man and Peter Parker were kind of anti-heroes, because they were nerdy.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think he was kind of nerdy before the term nerd even came about. He was kind of nerdy, and I got to know him a bit. I worked with him on, he drew a Big Boy comic book for me, of all things, and I called him up when I first got to New York to work for the Muppets, and I said, you want to come over and see the Creature Shop and meet Jim Henson? And he goes, I'm not familiar with the Muppets, and I don't know who Jim Henson is, but is there a free lunch involved? So he came over, and he invited, and he and Jim Henson shook hands. It was one of the greatest days of my life. I think they could have cared less. Jim didn't know who Spider-Man was, and Steve didn't know who Kermit the Frog was, but for me it was pretty exciting. Then Steve invited me to his studio, and it was about the size of this table, and there was only his drawing table and his chair, and there was no chair for me to sit and worship God. But I just sat on a stack of Ayn Rand fanzines that Steve had. So
Ayn Rand fanzines are good to sit on.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I agree. I don't like to sit your butt on them, but you can wipe your butt with them, as far as I'm concerned. But I hope I haven't offended any of Ann's followers. There's plenty of you probably here and in the government. So, have I been obnoxious enough? That was my goal. They said I could promote my books if I was on the panel. So I've done 5 Ditko books, including this one of like his 1, 2, and 3 pagers, where I think he's like a genius because he tells a whole story in 1 or 2 or 3 pagers. This was a Simon and Kirby book. You know, I'm not a big superhero fan anymore, but I love Simon and Kirby's, like, they interpreted readers' dreams, and they gave each reader $10, and then they owned the story and all the rights. And while Steve was drawing Doctor Strange and what was the character? Spider-Man. He was also drawing Conga and Gorgo. And then I did this picture of Steve, or this book of Steve. So that's some of the book. They said I could pimp. That was, I take a lot of inspiration from Stan. He was a great promoter, so I promote my books like obnoxiously, like Stan did. So wheeler dealer, you know, showman, ballyhoo type of guy. So that's me and Steve and all that.
All right, we've posed a couple of questions, and we'll turn this loose to the audience as well. One of the things I'd ask you guys to think about, we've got 3 important creators, and I think as Mark said, really we're talking about collaboration here. But for just a moment, maybe to think of them to some degree individually. If you had to pick out one story, not necessarily the best story that they worked on in this time period from 61 to 67 or so, if you had one story that said, you know, this particular story has all of the essential magic of Stan Lee's work, or Jack Kirby's work, or Steve Ditko's work, what's one story you could pick out that would show things off that way? You want to take a swing at this?
It is really difficult because there are several that I really do tend to love. One that's fascinating to me is Journey to Mystery 112, which was the fight between the Thor and the Hulk. And one of the things that was fascinating about it was that the idea was, in Avengers 3, there was a moment when Thor and the Hulk sort of broke off from the fight where the rest of the Avengers were fighting the Submariner. And so there was this concept that in a couple of minutes there was this just huge slugfest between 2 titans who then wove back into the Avengers story. And I found that concept fascinating just because it fit with Stan's view of the whole crisscrossing of the continuities, as did Amazing Spider-Man Annual 1, which was the epitome of that. And it also took a moment and sort of, it was as if somebody decided, we've got this novel, but there's actually a short story between chapters 18 and 19. And Stan was very influenced also by novels. He was a huge science fiction fan. He loved Arthur C. Clarke. I remember sending him a copy of Childhood's End because he just loved that novel. And so in a way, I think that would be one of them. There are others that I think are just fantastic. Again, Spider-Man 33, Fantastic Four 51, This Man, This Monster. There are certain stories, but I think those also, I don't know that I could give that just to Stan because I think those are the collaborations.
Absolutely. Mark, you want to take one?
This is a tough question. I never thought of them as individual stories. I thought of them as one big novel, and all the individual issues were chapters in a larger picture. I think the thing that stands out, the story arc of Galactus and the Silver Surfer, first coming to Earth, introducing those characters, I think is one of the most powerful things ever done in comics. I think one of the problems that the industry has had is everybody's trying to do that storyline again in different ways, and it's lost its punch. Steve was mentioning the death of
George Stacy,
and it's a story that I think has been enormously diminished by the 585 imitations of it.
I think the Gwen Stacy one gets imitated more.
Well, I think that we've now, I mean, this is off the subject of Simon and Kirby a little bit here, but I think Death in comics has become very meaningless. I don't think anybody can do anything with any emotion, because you know they're going to be back when the next writer takes over, he's bringing that character back.
It's just a marketing, that's right.
Yeah, well, a lot of this is marketing. I mean, I think that the idea of the shared universe in Marvel was a marketing thing. Stan just thought, oh, I'll cross-promote these comics, and it's another way of advertising each other's books, and maybe some kid. I don't think he even thought of it as a grand, something that was going to be important, integral to Marvel Comics until the readers told him. Stan was highly influenced by the mail that Marvel got. He read it all. In fact, one of the things that Ditko complained to me about when I was talking about Stan is how one reader would say something in and Stan would turn to Ditko and say, oh, we got to do this in the book. The readers are demanding it. And Ditko would say, how many readers? And Stan was, if I got one letter here, and you don't change your overall thrust of anything based on one reader or two readers, because you're theoretically trying to sell a couple 100,000 copies of each of these books. So I can't name an issue specifically. I mentioned the Galactus Silver Surfer one that I think is a one. And Steve mentioned the Master Planner storyline ended with that famous Spider-Man trapped under the machinery, which is a fabulous storyline. When Mr. Ditko insists Stan had nothing to do with the plotting of it, and I can believe that. I think Stan had very little to do with the plotting of a lot of those comics. And I've answered the question here. Okay.
Yeah, that gets, absolutely.
I guess I'm not enough of a Marvel addict to know a specific story, but I guess if I had to take one Marvel comic to a desert island, it would be like some early Doctor Strange issue where, like he's in this crazy, floating through this crazy world or something with all this surrealism. And I used to be a hippie. Okay, I still am. And my hippie friends would all think like that, that, wow, whoever drew this must have been on acid, man. And so cool. And in reality, I think Ditko was probably the only drug he took was X-Lax or something, but he had this incredible imagination, that was played out on these psychedelic pages, and so those would be my faves.
All right, I want to go back just for one moment. I'm going to turn this loose to the audience, to that concept of the shared universe and how that develops. And Mark, you suggested that was primarily Stan's idea. Steve, you cited Spider-Man Annual #1, when there were cameo appearances by virtually all of the other existing Marvel characters at that time. So, first question, Steve, just to follow up on that point. That aspect of the plot for Spider-Man Annual #1, is that Stan's contribution adding to what Ditko is doing? Would you attribute that primarily to him? And then in a general sense, how does this concept of the shared universe evolve over that time? Steve, you also said that Stan tended to make his best decisions when he got 30 seconds to do it. Was this an improvisational act to create these interlinked storylines, these interlinked characters, or was it a plan as well? Well, let's take this one.
One thing to keep in mind is that to some degree, one of the most perfect crossovers of that sort that took two major characters of the Marvel Universe and put them together would be Marvel Mystery 8, 9, and 10.
Absolutely.
Where the Human Torch and the Submariner crossed over, and not only did the Human Torch and the Submariner cross over, but the Human Torch was drawn by Carl Burgos, the Submariner was drawn by Bill Everett, and it was a great event that they actually repeated 2 or 3 times in the 40s. And so I don't think it was something Stan invented. However, I do think that the idea of this bigger universe probably really, he probably got jazzed by it. And I think that there you're going back to that Fantastic Four #1 is very important. I think in a way, Spider-Man 1, that might have, I'm guessing by what these gentlemen are saying about Steve, because I just knew Steve very, very casually. I am going to guess that the sudden cameos by all those characters was probably something Stan requested. Because I find that a very odd thing for Steve to have done. And it's a funny thing because it's not as sublime a story as Spider-Man Annual 2, which is the Doctor Strange crossover. which to me is absolutely brilliant. And that's that scene where, there you go.
I think, yeah, that would be a
Because
specific issue.
there's a great scene where Spider-Man is floating in another dimension with all the weird stuff floating in the sky and everything. And he's like, somehow I don't think I'm going to get back to Queens on the crosstown bus. and I'm therein, I'm going to bet that that's a Stan element. So again, it all weaves so brilliantly together that I do think it's far more difficult to tell where the spark came from, where the fleshing came from, where the fleshing was elaborated upon. I think it's a more organic process, most likely. But I do think that the cool thing for fans was to read that Amazing Spider-Man Annual 1 and go, oh my God, it's the X-Men. Oh my God, it's Iron Man. Wait a minute, there's Thor. Holy cow, Doc Strange just floated by. And suddenly you're thinking, oh my God, first of all, this is my world because New York really exists. And then on top of it, it's like all these characters, and they really are in the same place. And there really is Spider-Man going, who the hell are you? And on a personal level, and I'll stop there, but one of the things I loved about Ditko, I then got to New York and moved to New York, and I looked up, and I'm like, holy crap, look at all the water towers. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so cool. And to this day, sometimes we'll just walk down the street going, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you almost expect to see somebody perched on top of one.
And every one of those water towers was designed by Steve Ditko.
Stan Lee.
Oh, here comes a counter.
But neither of them gets credit for it.
I am reasonably certain that Spider-Man, Doctor Strange crossover and Spider-Man #2 was the case where Stan said to Ditko, I want to stick Doctor Strange in that book, and Ditko did it under duress. He didn't like the, I think he said it in one of his few essays, one of these that he wrote. But it's a wonderful story. It's one of my favorite stories that they did. And actually, sometimes some very good comic books have resulted from two guys not being on the same wavelength. Sometimes it's a disaster. Every so often it works. Two people who are not pulling in the same direction. I would bet serious money, and we can never prove this either way, that the concept of the shared universe was invented by the readers of Marvel Comics writing in about how they liked that. I would wager that Stan Lee never uttered the thought, never even thought of the phrase shared universe until a lot of readers had said, I'm not even sure I ever heard him say that term. But you got to look at the era here we're looking at. In the 60s, the common belief in comic book companies was that they did not have regular readers. This is why continued stories at DC were absolutely verboten. And every writer was told over and over again, this is someone's first issue. Somebody reading, you got to make sure these things stand alone so somebody who doesn't know who Aquaman is can figure it out in the early pages, whatever story you're writing. And I believe that at Marvel, Stan had an advantage over DC in that DC had 8 editors, I think, and they didn't even read each other's books. Stan was the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and he read all the books because he was writing or editing them all. And I think what happened was that he just figured out we need a plot here. And I think they wanted to keep the Hulk alive with his comic flounder, so they had him guest in a couple of other comics just to keep the character going, hoping that they'd find another place for him. And they got favorable reader response. They probably got some sales bumps, and they started realizing the value. And they started realizing that they had steady readers. They were amazed they got mail. The first letter pages in Marvel Comics in the earliest days were fake letters. There were a couple of them were signed by Saul Brodsky, who was the production manager. And there's one letter in early Fantastic Four from Stan Lee's wife. And Stan would say in the letter page, hey, we're just swamped with mail. Oh my God, we got an avalanche and we're buried in mail. They've gotten 5 letters. This is one of the areas of hype that Stan was very good at, was this idea of we're taking over the world, Marvel's on the march, and things like that. And he kind of made it true by wish fulfillment. He kept saying it, readers thought, oh, this is where I want to be. I want to be part of this movement. And he got, and he was very good, and he understood, you know, at DC, you know, they would come in and they'd say the last issues, we just have a sales report on that issue. It had a gorilla on the cover. It sold real well. Put a gorilla on the next cover.
And they have a lot of gorilla covers.
And Marvel, it was, hey, you know, having the Hulk guest star on Thor, that issue sold real well. Put the Hulk in more covers. Let's do more of that. I think that it is the readers who drove that very simply. And, you know, and then all of a sudden they realized they could do convenient stories because they did have some of the same people reading every month. And this was revolutionary. One of the things that scared the hell out of the DC editors was the realization that Marvel had steady readers. Even if, and I'm not sure exactly how they came to this decision, but there were indicators of it. If you had a DC comic selling 200,000 and a Marvel comic selling 200,000, most of the 200,000 buying the Marvel were the same people buying every month, whereas DC had people picking them up casually and not getting every issue. They were reaching a wider group, but there were more sporadic purchasers. And this was one of the things that panicked them because somehow Marvel was reaching the readership in a different way, a more meaningful way. And as you can see throughout the 60s, the history of DC in the 60s, is them trying to, and misunderstanding how to imitate Marvel a lot. And they tried crossovers, and they didn't do it as well, because in many cases they were done by different editors. DC had this book called The Brave and the Bold that was edited by a man named George Cashton, who kind of prided himself on not reading the other editor's books in the office. So the people putting together the Green Arrow, Martian Manhunter team up really weren't fans of Green Arrow or Martian Manhunter.
Actually, Craig, can I jump in for just a second? There's
Sure.
one thought I'd like to throw out here. Because like I had the good fortune of being fairly good friends with Joe Simon. And that was a lot of fun. And when you sat in Joe's living room, there was a big picture window that looked south. And one of the things you saw in easy view was the McGraw-Hill building, which was where Timely Comics was when Joe worked there in 1940 and hired Stan Lee. Now the thing is that if you're in New York, one of the things you can do is look up and see the water towers, look over and see the Chrysler building, look down and see the McGraw-Hill building. And I do wonder a little if we're almost attributing too much business to some of this, because I could imagine Stan or anybody walking down the street and going, oh, there's one of the water towers Steve does. I can picture Spider-Man on that. I can picture, you know, Iron Man flying over there. Wait a minute. And wait a minute, that could be where the Baxter building is. And hey, that could actually be a bunch of them, like, I could be looking at them now. And so I could almost imagine a natural progression for someone who's a writer to think, well, why not? And so I could actually, I don't know if that would be the shared universe, but at the same time, yes, I think that the marketing part might take over, but there could actually just be wouldn't it be cool if we just like had Spider-Man perched up there and the Fantastic Car flew over there? And I don't know. I mean, I just honestly don't know. I'm not claiming any kind of credibility to this, but I can imagine that.
It feels as if, with that shared universe, just to jump off that for a moment, if Spider-Man Annual 1 introduces that, it is a year later, Fantastic Four Annual 3, I believe, with the wedding of Reed Richards and Sue Storm, Mr. Fantastic, and then the Invisible Girl, where all of the Marvel characters come together for one extended story for the first time. Matt Murdock is the lawyer.